Okay, welcome back to our Elephants in the Room series. We have just heard Autumn talk about the spiritual realm. I thought that was a really good, eye-opening message. Today I'm going to talk about something that isn't a very light subject. It's not something that a lot of people even talk about in general. Some people might get uncomfortable about it, and that's why I'm going to talk about. And that is human trafficking. To start with, I'm going to start with a story about a girl named Carla from Mexico. 43,200. So I want you to think about that number, 43,200. That is the amount of times that she was raped in the hands of her human traffickers. 30 different men a day, 7 days a week, for 4 years. When Carla was around 5 years old, she already grew up in an abusive home. She was abused by a relative that was close to her. When she was 12 years old was when she was targeted by her human trafficker. He was nice to her. He was 22 years old at the time. He made her feel special. He bought her gifts, and eventually she went to live with him. She escaped with him. She lived with him. 3 months into living with each other, he started to teach her and tell her about all these things that she needed to do with the clients. She was only 12 years old. Keep in mind, she started in the morning and she would finish around midnight. She got abused by her trafficker. He would beat her with a chain, kick her, pull her hair, burned her with an iron. When she was 15 years old, she became pregnant by one of the pimps. He used that child, baby girl, against her and said that he couldn't see, she couldn't see the baby until she would do everything that he wanted. And eventually, a year later, she got to finally see her baby. At the age of 16 was when she got rescued by an anti-trafficking operation. Carla is now 23 years old, and she has become an advocate for human trafficking. And in her speech, one of her speeches that she gives, she says, "Take the blindfold off your eyes and hear my story. Doing nothing puts countless girls at risk of being trafficked for years and raped for tens of thousands of times, just like I was." Human trafficking is happening all over, not just in the streets of Mexico, but also in the homes. When I was going through just the different testimonies and the stories of these girls, there was one girl, one story that I came across. Her name is Dee Dee. And just how horrifying it is that when she was only 4 years old, her father allowed his male friends to sleep with her, to get in bed into her. And he would stay there. He would watch all these men just get into bed with her, and then they would leave. He would kiss her on the forehead, tuck her in at night, tell her that he loved her. And she was so confused. She didn't know why her father was allowing this to happen to her. She didn't even realize that she was being trafficked up until she was older. And this happened up until the age of 18. She is now also an activist for victims of human trafficking, but it took a really big toll on her. You know, she grew up to look to men for affirmation, developed an eating disorder, and fell into an abusive relationship. Getting into this subject, it wasn't easy. I had to really ask the Lord what exactly it is that he wanted me to talk about, in this sense, what he wanted me to bring. And I just want to let you guys know that this subject has really broke my heart, and I hope that by the end of this that it touches your heart in the same way that it touches mine. So I'm just going to pray really quick. Father God, I pray that you will just be here in this place, that you will speak to us, Lord, that you will break our hearts for what breaks yours, that you will give us your compassion and your love for others. In Jesus' name. So I'm going to read out of Matthew 25, if you have your Bibles. I'm going to be reading out of the parable of the sheep and the goats. That is Matthew 25, verse 31. So it says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? Then the king will reply, truly I will tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And in verse 45, he replies, truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. This message is more than just about human trafficking, but it's also about the least of these. It's about the marginalized. It's about, just the social injustices that are going on in this world. And what is the church doing about it? What are we as Christians doing about this? So to start off, I want to ask you a question. And the first question is, to start off, are we even praying about it? And I know that, the church is trying to get across, praying for the persecuted church, which is good. But is the church also trying to, pray for those that are being trafficked, thousands a year, those that are the orphans, those are the homeless? Are we praying about it? And I'll admit that I don't pray about it as much. I don't even bother to think about this. And the second question that I want to ask is, does your heart break for the social injustices that are going on in this world? I want to bring you across a few statistics just to get your mind wrapped around what the reality is for human trafficking and how it looks like today. The first one is that it is estimated that internationally there are between 20 million to 40 million people in modern slavery today. Between 18,000 and 20,000 victims are trafficked into the U.S. each year. Only 0.4 survivors of human trafficking cases are identified, meaning that the rest go undetected. In 2018, over half of the criminal human trafficking cases in just the U.S. were involving only children. Human trafficking earned global profits of roughly $150 billion a year for traffickers, and $99 billion of which comes from commercial sexual exploitation. When you hear something like that, does it break your heart? Does it stir up something inside of you? And if it does, or it doesn't, it either does or it doesn't. And if it does, then the third question that I want to ask is, are we being the hands and feet of Jesus? Do we focus more on the numbers that we are bringing in the church rather than the souls that we're taking care of? And if yes, then we're missing the purpose and the point of which Jesus and which God wanted the church to be. Let's start being the church rather than doing church. Jesus, what did he do with most of his ministry on earth? He spent it with tax collectors, with prostitutes, with those that were being exiled from the rest of society. Isaiah 61, he says, for the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor, proclaim freedom for the captives, release prisoner from darkness, bind up the brokenhearted. That passage doesn't just apply to Jesus. That passage also applies to us. We are called to live the life that Jesus lived on this earth. We're called to continue the work that he has started. How many know who Natalie Grant is? She's a very successful, famous Christian artist, but she's also a human traffic activist. And when she first heard about sex trafficking was through a TV show called Law & Order, SVU. Love that show, by the way. And she was just troubled that the people in the church weren't really discussing about this. So she went with a nonprofit organization to India just to kind of get on the field and to see what this is. So I want to read you a little bit on what her experience was when she was over there. And just a little brief part. She says, I met twin 5-year-old girls who had to have reconstructive surgery to their tiny little bodies. I saw a 6-year-old girl in a cage looking at me through the bars of a cage, and she wasn't screaming. She wasn't asking for anyone to bring her freedom. It was almost as it was almost as if she was resigned to the fact that this was her reality, thinking that her husband was a potential buyer. The brothel owners allowed them to, tour the facility. And she says, and as we walked through these tiny little cubicles, some with mattresses on the floor, some with beds, I will never forget walking past one that had a rope tied on the end of a bedpost. And I made the mistake of asking why the rope was there. And the gentleman we were with said, that's because the girl in this room is 15 years old. She has an 18-month-old child. There's no child care. So they tethered their children to the end of the bed while they're forced to perform their sexual acts. Natalie has committed her life to Proverbs 31:8, which says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves and ensure justice for those who are being crushed. I wish I could speak more about this. I could probably go on, but I really encourage you guys to look into, human trafficking, to look into the stories, and to look into what exactly the very minimum that the government is doing. That there are websites out there like Craigslist that actually sell people online. That there is a huge, huge connection and impact that pornography has with human trafficking. I challenge you that as the church, to be the next generational church that speaks on these matters. That as a community that we come together to pray and to get out of our comfort zone and to be the hands and feet of Jesus. Ask God to break your heart for the social injustice and the wickedness that is going on in this world that so desperately needs Jesus.